What is up, everybody? Welcome to Block and Build, a podcast from Convergence Magazine. I'm your host and the publisher of Convergence, Caden Mock. On this show, we're building a roadmap for the movement that's working to block the impacts of rising authoritarianism while building the strength and resilience of the broad front that we need to win. Before we get started, I want to thank Lisa Venneklassen for joining us this week as a Movement Legacy subscriber. If you'd like to join her, I invite you to join our subscriber program. Convergence Magazine is an independent publication that relies on the generosity of our readers and listeners to create the rigorous, thoughtful takes that you've come to expect from us week in and week out. You can become a subscriber at convergencemag.com/donate. Any amount helps, either as a one-time donation or a recurring monthly or annual subscription. This week on the show, I'm joined by the Principal of Ejerie Labs, Ejeris Dixon. Ejeris recently launched the Fascism Barometer, a podcast and resource hub working to educate communities already feeling authoritarian impacts about what fascism is and how we can stop it. We'll explore the history of the creeping fascist trend in our society and politics, and how we all should think about our relationship to state power in 2025. Before that, I'm going to talk to Joo-Hyun Park, a movement media colleague at The Real News and organizer with No Dol, about what's been unfolding in South Korea since the unsuccessful coup attempt by President Yoon Suk-yeol on December 3rd. But first, these headlines from this week. Now that authorities have taken the alleged shooter of the United Healthcare CEO, Luigi Mangione, into custody, the internet has absolutely exploded. Between pillorying the mainstream media for whitewashing Brian Thompson to reading the tea leaves of Mangione's social media history, folks have been busy. It's the wild speculation about his political commitments, though, that have kind of been making me itch. Something that I've noticed is that a lot of folks seem to want to sew him neatly into some kind of ideological box. But I'm going to be honest with you, the 26-year-old Mangione, who's Ivy League educated, working in the tech industry, playing trending video games, is actually just kind of a guy. Even looking at Mangione's Goodreads, his log of what he's read and what he thought about it, exposes that for the most part, he's reading New York Times bestsellers. While we might describe some of his posts on social media as vaguely right-wing, and his self-understanding as the main character is certainly inflated, he isn't somebody who is meaningfully radicalized in any particular direction. He doesn't seem to have a theory of social power, and he really isn't that unusual, I think, for 26-year-old guys in the United States. Mangione isn't the avatar of some kind of new class solidarity, nor is he a kind of harbinger of class traitors to come. He's just proof that neoliberalism is touching us all. Increasing precarity through the undermining of organized labor and the financialization of literally everything, like, for instance, healthcare, has made life really expensive and uncertain for lots of people outside of really just the ultra-mega wealthy. Maybe instead of trying to force him into a neatly predetermined ideological narrative, we should tell the story of this profound hollowing out of what it means to be a society, and also why someone might think it would change the system by shooting one CEO. Also, in a surprising turn of events, the rebel coalition fighting the Assad regime in Syria forced the dictator out on Sunday, the culmination of just a few weeks of intensified fighting that also saw the collapse of Assad's support from Russia and Iran. Syrians celebrated the fall of the dictatorship while also bracing for the uncertainty to come. In addition to liberating the prisons, huge swaths of people were out in the streets earlier today, joyously celebrating during Friday's call to prayer. What remains to be seen is which of the many rebel factions of the coalition that have ousted Assad will fill that power vacuum, and how. And now to our first guest. Previously on the show, we have talked about how mass turnout in the streets in Seoul led to the failure of President Yoon's attempt to implement martial law in South Korea and stage a coup. While it seems like a lot of the Western media has really moved on from this story, complications, further details, and continued protests continue to unspool as the nation deals with the fallout and learns more about what President Yoon's intentions were. My first guest today is Joo-Hyun Park. They continued movement media coverage of the story this week, publishing a great piece today at the People's Dispatch titled, "Was South Korea's Coup an Attempt to Restart the Korean War?" I'm really excited that we can get a little bit deeper into this story and to what those of us living in the United States should take in terms of lessons from this threat to democracy abroad, and also fold into our own movement work. Joo-Hyun, thanks so much for joining me today and for covering this story.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Caden.
So somewhere I want to start is actually before December 3rd, because I think something that a lot of U.S. media missed in the run-up to those events were that this increasingly hostile stance that the Yoon government was taking towards North Korea. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and also what the U.S. stake and involvement kind of was in that?
Absolutely. So, some listeners may be familiar with the rapprochement that was underway on the Korean Peninsula about a decade ago under the government of Moon Jae-in, who was the predecessor to the current president, Yoon Suk-yeol. Now, under President Yoon, the inter-Korean relationship has completely collapsed, and I don't think that's a hyperbolic statement at all. He ran on a platform of adopting a military strategy that would allow South Korea to launch preemptive strikes on North Korea, which he adopted pretty much the moment he came into office. Last year, he also took the very bizarre step of declaring North Korea his government's so-called principal enemy, and has since then been promoting a stance on reunification that is very contradictory to the viewpoint that was advanced by progressive South Korean governments and by the government of North Korea over the last past half century. The formula for unification has always involved peaceful reunification, an independent process that's free from foreign influence, and probably one that ends up in some kind of power sharing agreement between two governments. The model that Yoon Suk-yeol has promoted instead is called reunification by absorption. It's the idea that South Korea should effectively annex North Korea, dissolve its socialist state, and then implement capitalist rule over North Korea instead. So obviously, this has been incredibly provocative, but the issues have not only been from the standpoint of policy, there's also been the problem of increased military activity and aggression. Last year, there were more than 200 days of war games on the Korean Peninsula between the militaries of the United States and South Korea. Under Yoon, South Korea has also started to enter what is called the JACUS Trilateral Alliance. JACUS stands for Japan, Korea, United States. This is a major, major breakthrough from the standpoint of Washington, because while South Korea and Japan have long been allies of the United States, they have also had incredible problems with one another stemming from Japan's colonial rule of Korea in the first half of the 20th century. What President Yoon did was to essentially steamroll over the demands of survivors of that colonial period in order to push through this new military alliance. So as a result, the geopolitical situation in Northeast Asia has also changed, where you now have the emergence of a much more unified US-led military bloc than in the past. And this has, of course, provoked a response. It was something like 1 or 2 months after the Washington Declaration, when this Japan-US-Korea alliance started to really come together, that North Korea also entered a strategic comprehensive partnership with Russia, which of course has been covered extensively in the US media, but has not really been explored in terms of understanding why that is and how it relates to US policy in the region, which Yoon Suk-yeol has been absolutely instrumental in advancing.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, it seems like the this escalation, the like U.S. alliance, I also think has been kind of undercovered in the U.S. media. Like it's not the sort of like causal relationship there is not being explored. Um, I imagine that a lot of our listeners have seen like the images and video that came out on December 3rd about the like mass protests in the streets and like seen some of the story. But a lot has been happening since then, obviously. Could you lay out a little bit about what has been revealed both in sort of like Korean civil society, but then also to members of the national legislature since December 3rd?
Absolutely. So, understandably, given that there was just a coup attempt, there have been pretty much daily emergency hearings in the National Assembly, which is South Korea's legislature, with various lawmakers probing exactly what happened on the night of December 3rd, how much planning went into it, and what else we can know about Yoon Suk Yeol's agenda on that night. What is starting to come to light is that there are increasing signs that President Yoon was seeking to initiate some sort of war with North Korea for the purpose of declaring martial law. Now, there are a number of claims that have been made, and I want to take the time to sort of properly take everyone through what's been said so far. The first instance was on December 7th, when a lawmaker came forward citing an anonymous military source saying that the ex-foreign minister not the foreign minister, the ex-defense minister, who is now under arrest, had attempted to issue an order for a direct strike on North Korea back in November. this was something that the military has since denied. However, there have been some other reports coming forward as well. So in October of this year, North Korea reported for the first time that South Korean drones had violated their airspace, and they were actually able to produce photographs of a number of crashed drones that bore a very strong resemblance to models that are known to be used by the South Korean military. At the time, the South Korean military did not confirm or deny, but simply said that they could not confirm whether the reports were true. And this was very quickly buried as well in the US media. And of course, the spotlight shifted back to North Korea a couple weeks later when the decision was made to detonate some of the roads and bridges connecting North and South Korea at the DMZ. What is now coming to light, again from lawmakers citing anonymous military sources, is that this was an order from the South Korean military to attempt to violate the airspace of North Korea and trigger some form of conflict. And then there are some other specific details that have come to light as well. This Sunday, there was a container fire on a South Korean military facility that was housing drones and launchers. And the military has since explained that that was due to electrical issues, but lawmakers are alleging that this is a cover-up attempt instead. Now, what may be the most shocking allegations put forward are being put forward by lawmaker Kim Byung-ju, who is actually a former four-star general in the South Korean army. He is saying that he has received word from multiple military sources that on the night of December 3rd, when the martial law order was declared, that the elite South Korean Special Forces HID unit had operatives in Seoul who were ready to help carry out arrests and potentially assassinations. That has been followed up by the testimony of a noted South Korean independent journalist named Kim Ho-jun. And I will note here that Kim Ho-jun is someone who is known to have been targeted on the night of December 3rd. There were South Korean military deployed to his studio. That has been confirmed. He has now come forward saying that he has received warnings and tips, not from a military source actually, but from someone in, all he was willing to say was a friendly embassy of a country, that has diplomatic relations with South Korea, saying that the actual full extent of the plan was to have special forces clad in North Korean uniform commit an assassination of Yoon Suk-yeol's party leader, Han Dong-hun. And the plan would have been to then dispose of these uniforms and have them discovered at a later time so that, the killing of Han Dong-hun could then be pinned onto North Korea. Kim Ho-jun has also said that himself and a number of other politicians would have been targeted for essentially a kidnapping at this time by these soldiers clad in North Korean uniforms to make it appear as if they had gone turncoat and as if the opposition had betrayed the country. So these are obviously some really stunning and shocking revelations. He's also brought forward other details, such as there may have been a plan to even kill US soldiers in an attempt to drag the US into the war. What I will say, after sharing all of this is that, this is an active investigation. We are, receiving these testimony in real time. There's still evidence that has yet to come to light. It has to be corroborated, but there is a picture coming together of clear motive and intent for a plan to start a war with North Korea as part of the coup attempt. And it's something that is going largely uncommented within the English language media.
Yeah, I mean, this is some pretty explosive stuff and some really it's almost like comic book like in its explosiveness, right? The sort of ambition and scope of this. One of the things I wonder is how are regular folks in South Korea responding to this news? Have you seen people commenting on this in Korean language media? What is the sort of conversation there? Because I know people are still in the streets in Seoul and elsewhere.
Well, the critical testimony from Kim Ho-jun just came out this on Friday morning Korea time, so not much time has passed. I myself woke up this morning and saw this testimony, so I've mostly been getting caught up and making sure that there is some there's some corresponding coverage of this in the English language, because I think it's important that even though we are still dealing with claims that have yet to be fully confirmed, that there is there's some archive that we can point back to, right? Particularly as the situation evolves. But I think what we can say very safely is that millions of people have mobilized for a reason, right? Martial law is something that is within the living memory of South Koreans. And it's something that people take very seriously because of the brutality of that period, because of the disappearances, the torture, the massacres that were committed. If folks have heard of the Gwangju massacre, which occurred in 1980, I would point out that there are people alive today who are still looking for the bodies of their loved ones who disappeared in those crucial days, right? So this is not something that is considered part of Korea's ancient history at all. And I think while there are a range of opinions about North Korea, what is very common for a broad segment of the population is not wanting war, right? So to hear that the president may have attempted to manufacture some kind of war, possibly including one that would have brought in the United States, which could not have been any kind of limited conflict, but would have certainly had a very high risk of spiraling into a regional or even a global war. I think that is something that, as more details come to light, we'll certainly be seeing a stronger response from, particularly from South Korea's progressive organizations, which do have a very strong anti-militaristic stance.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you. And then I guess my last question for you is especially those of us who don't speak Korean, who are part of U.S. social movements, who are interested in international solidarity and committed to global peace. What do you think we should be paying attention to in the coming weeks? What are the things that you're tracking, and where can people learn more?
Right. So what I'm paying attention to personally is these investigations in the National Assembly. I think it's very, very important that people in the US have an eye on this, and understanding that, folks may not be able to keep up with the developments in real time, but it is something that we need to be paying attention to, because we should be asking the question, what did Washington know? And, essentially, when did they know it, right? The US military holds operational wartime command over South Korea's military. They're very, very strongly and tightly integrated fighting forces. I would refer people to the work of the journalist KJ No, who's done an excellent job of discussing why it is exactly that it's just very, very unlikely that the US military didn't have some kind of advance warning, because even just to move South Korean soldiers within the peninsula requires very close communication between the two militaries, only for the purpose of avoiding accidents, right? So this is something that I think folks need to be paying attention to, and particularly this detail around the allegation of a plot to kill US soldiers. I mean, if there were US officials who even had an inkling that that could be the case and did nothing, I mean, I would dare to say that, that would be grounds for treason, right?
Yeah, that's
so I think
again explosive.
Yeah, exactly. So I definitely think it's something that, folks need to keep their eye on. I know that, there are a lot of struggles unfolding at the moment. People are not having an easy time, and, there's many causes for justice that need to be pushed forward. But all of those causes for justice also depend on us not having World War III or any kind of nuclear conflict with nuclear powers.
Right.
So I think that, this is something that if folks have not been previously paying attention to, I would urge you to find out more, to continue paying attention to what's being put out.
Yeah, well, I appreciate you making the time to talk with us, and for all of your work bringing this story to English language U.S. media. We'll put a link to the People's Dispatch story in the show notes so people can learn more. Is there any place that people should follow you, Jihyun?
Sure, you can follow my Twitter. It's hermit_hwarang. Hwarang is spelled Hwarang. And I would also encourage folks to follow Norutdol, Nodutdol. That's an anti-imperialist organization that I'm part of, which is made up of folks from the Korean diaspora. And a lot of the work that we do is focused on unpacking and uncovering these issues of U.S. imperialism in the peninsula, and really exposing the constant barrage of U.S. war maneuvers that are being made.
Perfect. Thank you so much, and take care. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
My next guest is Ejeris Dixon. As I said previously, Ejeris has a new show, a new podcast that they've started making called the Fascism Barometer, which is part of a larger project to kind of track the ascent of authoritarianism here in the U.S. And I'm excited to talk to Ejeris today about that project, and also I think this question about how folks who are prison abolitionists should be thinking about state power in this coming period, because it's something that I've been thinking a lot about, and it's something that we think a lot about here at Convergence Magazine. Ejeris, welcome to Block and Build. It's nice to see you.
It's so good to be here. Thanks for having me in. I'm really excited.
Excellent. I've heard you say elsewhere, and this is something that's really consistent with our editorial on it at Convergence, is that we're living in this culmination of 5, even we might say 6 decades at this point of fascist strategy in this country. Could you lay out a little bit of that history and talk a little bit about like what you see as sort of like U.S. flavored fascism in our history?
Sure, you come with the easy question.
Oh yeah.
So I'm like, here we go. No, I'll start with like, this is my assessment from my understanding and my best guess, because I see myself as a kind of person who is really interested in fascism, right? And so I think there's like, we see roots of politics that we would call fascist throughout U.S. history. Right? And so we go even further back than 5 and 6 decades. And I think it's also useful to start by just defining fascism, because like people use the term, but maybe are like, you know, we can get into the space of where it's like everything we dislike is fascist, and we need to actually get a little bit more we get a little more crisp than that. And it's one of the reasons I started the project. So when I'm thinking about fascism, I'm thinking about a kind of ultra-nationalist, anti-democratic, far-right movement, but a movement where people see themselves as, where the kind of majority sees itself as the victim, right? And it's fighting against marginalized communities and democratic practices and policies for its survival, right? So like, fascists believe that democracy has failed them and allowed for their victimization, right? So it's this piece around, and so that's why they seek to eliminate both democracy and marginalized communities to return to this often fictitious past. And so we Mussolini first started the kind of the fascist party in 1920, but there's a lot of fascism that's even earlier in U.S. history, and really Black, Indigenous communities of color have often lived underneath the fascist and supremacist state. So I like to talk about fascist movements versus fascist governments versus fascist societies, and see them as a progression. And all of us who have done movement building work, organizing, if you understand how movements work, sometimes they're thinking about movements on the left, but there are also movements on the right. And so as they gain power, then this is what they can deploy. So there was an article I wrote a while ago that talked about the Cornerstone speech in 1860. And it's this speech that the vice president of the Confederacy gives that really talks about why the Constitution wasn't racist enough. And essentially, no, I mean it. Why the
no, it sounds absurd, but I understand. Like, I believe it, right? Like,
and why the Confederacy is necessary to kind of that the cornerstone of true government in this country should be that Black people are not equal to white people, and that slavery is natural, normal, and appropriate. Right? So we can go all the way back there. And there are lots of ways where like white supremacist policies, things that we would call fascist now really were inspired by what was happening in the US. So then you have this interplay between kind of progressive advances and like the growth of fascist movements. So you see like the rise of the Ku Klux Klan post Reconstruction, right? And that you can see as like evidence of like fascist movements gaining power, moving into some forms of governance when you start to look at Jim Crow laws, for instance. And then you have places where actual like Nazis came to the US to study Jim Crow laws, to go back to Germany, to kind of to create the Nuremberg laws, which were the laws that kind of started to like separate Jews, disabled folks, gypsies, like all kinds of different communities, but a lot of that was predicated on their learnings here in the US. And Rachel Maddow actually does a very good job in like Prequel and a bunch of podcasts on kind of talking about this like interplay, like founding of the American Nazi Party, Nazi rallies that happened at Madison Square. Like people were like, oh, last time a fascist rally or the MAGA rally happened, was in the 1930s, right? So we keep having these tethers. You have you can like keep pushing. You see tenets of Nazism in McCarthyist movements. You see it in COINTELPRO and in the way that kind of J. Edgar Hoover sought to like eliminate movements, eliminate a Black Messiah, all of those pieces. And then I was watching this documentary recently on the history of Christian nationalism because I was like, I want to get more on Christian nationalism, and it was talking about really about it as a rebrand of kind of segregationist movements, right? So there was this history of as schools were getting integrated, then in the South there would be these creation of kind of white Christian churches, and then there were some lawsuits around those, and it was in defense of like white Christianity, because recognizing that like the power of segregationists, it was a losing game, right? Like they were not going to be able to rule as segregationists, but they could create, so the Christian right is a rebrand of segregationist forces, people, policies, all of that. It takes to like the first time people said "Make America Great Again," which we can locate within like kind of one of Ronald Reagan's campaigns.
Right.
And then like there's like Bill Clinton used the phrase, Hillary Clinton used the phrase, but so we've got these tendrils of fascism, right, that go kind of all the way back. But the what I'm really interested in is, so yes, we've got fascism all the way into the founding of this country, but fascism is a process, right? Defining it, locating it is actually kind of slippery. And it's why this barometer piece is really important to me, because my hunger was, where are we? Right? Where are we on the barometer? What does that mean for our safety? What does that mean for our people? What does it mean for our organizing? Because the tactics shift depending on the tools that they have, the power that they have amassed. Right? So whether you call them Christian nationalists, white supremacists, white nationalists, like whatever you call them, this tendency to both eliminate democratic practices, policies, and like kind of targeted and marginalized people, it's got a really long history, and we've produced a lot of it. And yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's really useful also because I think you're right that like there is a way that mobilizing fascism as like this sort of like the F word that we like call our enemies this, but we don't necessarily have a sort of grounded analysis, is like maybe one of the worst tendencies of the sort of like clickbait information economy, right? And that I also think the other thing that you laying out this history made me think about too is that like, so much of which I think is just like a largely useless debate about whether or not the first Trump administration was or was not a fascist government. Like one of the places that I think that sort of like useless argument spins its wheels in is the fact that like fascism does like this insight that it is a process, right? And that like fascism in different places in different times is going to look different because it, like any good sort of like ideology or movement that is like effective at capturing power, it can adapt to the conditions in which it finds itself. And the conditions are also, they're economic, they're cultural, they're about the balance of forces. And that I think that like that work and that work that you were doing with the Fascism Barometer and also previously with that Fascism 101 series is like super helpful for people who are actually trying to understand what the hell's actually going on here.
Yeah, like those debates were so annoying and unhelpful and in some ways demobilizing, right? Because the reason the word fascism was meaningful for me to use is what people understand around how you organize against it, right? Don't collaborate with fascists, you defeat fascists. Fascist means you need, like, fascists try to move quickly. Fascists try to put our people in jail. Fascists try to enact violence on our people. But when we're calling it other things that sound safer, Um,
Mhm.
maybe one day evolve into fascism. So like there was like me and Tarso, my friend Tarso who's at Political Research Associates. We had a lot of
Friend of the pod,
conversations about it.
Tarso.
Yep. And eventually, we landed, and Tarsa was like, well, the truth is, you only want to be a premature fascist. And I was like, sure, I'd rather y'all call me premature than all of us in the same detention camp, and, me being like, I guess I was right.
Dude.
um, it's like the thing you so don't want to get wrong, you'd rather be premature. Call me alarmist. But the thing is that the barometer is newer, but I've been obsessed with fascism and how to distill it for folks since 2016, mostly because anytime something dangerous comes with like a term or a concept that I find hard to define, I kind of throw myself into it. Like long history as an organizer, long history in political education. And therefore I'm like, it's not good if there's something that's dangerous out there that we are having trouble defining, organizing around, and contesting. So I saw
Right.
the need to distill fascism as as a way to support community to organize against it, right? And so that's where it was. So since 2016, I've been writing articles, I've been facilitating workshops. And so that's kind of how I ended up in the Fascism 101 configuration. Like Ash had me at Highlander kind of speak on kind of where we were at in the timeline of fascism. That was like a year or two before Fascism 101. Me and Linda Burnham had met at a gathering where I was also like doing a talk on fascism because the other issue is that it's not an issue, it's a growth edge for our movements. We've got a lot of research about the right wing. We don't have a lot of information for organizers and targeted communities on what we need to do to change to contest with rise and power. And so the reports only help us if they're distilled. Right? If they're distilled into workshops, they're distilled into like 5 ways you can pivot your campaign. If they're, because otherwise the information is kind of like washing over us. And the psychology of fascism is really like our bodies, our spirits, our systems are going to do anything to stay grounded in the face of fear. Right?
Yeah, so it's designed to be overwhelming. Yeah.
Right? It's designed to be overwhelming. And so therefore, like it happened during the first Trump administration. Something terrible happens and then you get used to things kind of being consistently terrible. So you don't actually react with the urgency or the pivots you need in your organizing. And so yeah, it's this ambitious project that is constantly evolving around just offering us a lot of tools on how we describe fascism, what changes under fascism, what it means. And what my hope is, like each episode, we take like a little bite out of the mystery, and to make it more clear. And the challenge in every episode, and I think the challenge to all of us in general, is to stop throwing around that are actually really important, like to start like distilling distilling really critical concepts, speaking in plain language, because I was like, I want this to be something that my mom understands. Because she needs to, right? Because I want this to be something that I can easily talk about with my cousins, with my family, because all of those folks care about politics. They talk about it differently than we do at like a meeting or like, kind of like, a leftist convening.
Sure.
But what we're seeing right now is the need to organize broader and bigger bases to mobilize more and more of our people to oppose what's happening. And that starts with understanding it clearly. I might have just talked too much, but
no, I'm picking up what you're putting down. Also, because I think that, what you're saying also to me gets to the heart of like, I mean, obviously I am a like leftist media producer. So I'm constantly thinking about like, what is our responsibility as independent media in this time to be talking about this stuff in ways that like the folks who listen to this show obviously are more likely to be like, already involved in social movements, thinking about stuff, but like, how can I be making shows, how can we be publishing articles that are easy for them to share with the people in their lives, to be like, it's going down for real. Like, this is
Yes.
not right. Like, it's actually happening.
Yeah.
Like, it is happening here, you know? And then I think that like there's obviously an important role for folks who are doing these like deeper, more technical dives to play, but that more and more we do need media that's going to talk about the like concepts in terms and framed in ways that like make sense to people and make sense to the impacts they have on their everyday lives. So I feel like that's like super fucking critical in this time.
Yeah, and it's, media is the new tool for me. There's a lot I'm learning here, and it's actually really exciting. Like I've been a person who's just like, I did organizing for a really long time, and then I did support to organizing, and I'm just like, I want this podcast to live in people's back pocket. I like imagine it as a thing where it's like, I want to hang out with you while you're doing dishes, right?
Yeah,
or
right.
Or while you're doing laundry, or like, and I want it to be, and the tone is important then, because I don't want to freak you out so bad, but I want to give you something you can chew on, and then like have the resources where it's like, was that interesting? Awesome. This is how you can get involved. I want it to be a tool for organizations and their members, right?
Yeah.
So that like most organizations do not have time to take up a anti-fascism political education project. And they shouldn't have to. You're doing enough. So here's an episode. Here's a sample agenda. Here are some other pieces, and that's what I'm really excited about using media to do. So like I'm coming to this as longtime political educator and like a person who's learning a lot about the power of kind of popular media, progressive media, and I've got dreams. I want cartoons. I want short video. I want like all these different things to make it easy, understandable. And to your point on the reports, the latest thing I'm working on is a checklist, like a checklist on fascist progression, where you can just be like, check. And so you can kind of have like a sense of like what's happening in your area, because in the time that we've all been talking about this, in the time that we had this debate, we moved from fascist movements to fascist state capture in like both localities and federally, right? And it's important to say, okay, that changes things, right? That changes things, and that does get into this conversation around the state and governing power and all of those pieces. But
that's I do know, unfortunately. That's a really good segue, though. I mean, one of the things I really wanted to talk to you about is because, like, I'm aware of your history working on transformative justice and in this sort of like abolitionist movement work that is about this sort of like very hands-on trying to figure out how we build a like real alternative, starting with like folks that we're closest to in our movements and in our social spaces. But one of the things I think that like has been frustrating to me is like trying to figure out how we have a conversation about state power and about governing power in this moment, where I think that like people are, there's like this sort of like Pollyanna-ish impulse to be like, well, we voted them out before, we can vote them out again. And then on the one hand, and on the other hand, there's sort of this like, fuck it, we don't fuck with the state, we don't think about it at all. And there's like obviously something that needs to be in the middle that is like about a real reckoning, right, with the state and state power, but that is also like realistic about the tools that we have at our disposal. And I'm very curious, like given your movement history, how you are thinking about how our movements need to be relating to state power right now. Not a small question, but like, let's get into it,
Yeah, you took I was like, waited, took this questions, let's do it. Yeah, like I think I'll start with just talking about my own history. I started in economic justice organizing, right? In racial justice, economic justice organizing. I've done police reform work and I've done abolitionist work. I'm a dabbler. So I'll start there because I'm
same here.
Yeah, and for me, it's also like sometimes I understand things better when I touch them, right? To know like, oh, not into it, not into this. And I have loved the transformative justice work. I feel it is really critical, but I also I'm not an anarchist, right? Like I believe in forms of government. I believe that liberatory governance is possible. I do
Mhm.
not know what it looks like. I also think that there's a difference between like visions and where we're going and where we want to be and where we are, right? And so,
Mhm.
and as kind of a strategist and as a tactician, so for me, I think like I was having a conversation with a friend, and a friend was like saying, "Oh, maybe we need to contend for governing power." I was like, how are we going to, like, power is how you manage. So we need to actually talk about power in general, right? So
Mhm.
there is this thing that's happening right now where folks are like, we've had backlash before, we've survived before, and we'll survive again. And I'm like, yeah, kind of. We're missing the parts around like some people survived.
Some
Like
people
some
survived.
people survived so that we can get here. And the level of courage, the level of strategy that's needed, the bar is higher, right? The bar is higher now. So we will absolutely need I see work around abolition, transformative justice, and fascism as really clear to me because I see them as the for and the against, right? And I want a world where people have what we need. I want a world where we can transform violence, maybe even not experience violence as a survivor of violence. And I know that fascism kind of cuts off our ability to do those things,
Mhm.
right? And at some point, it's very hard to focus. So I'm one of the people that's like things have to get worse for us to break through. And I actually think that those philosophies can be really irresponsible, especially for people like us, right? Who are kind of the like in team, first, second team to go, right?
Yeah.
And
Right. Yeah.
um and that's historical, right? The communities that are targeted first. So the questions on how I think that abolitionists need to build power, and we see that in also our ability to stop cop cities and our ability to
Mhm.
do the defund, like all of these pieces involve power. It doesn't mean that like we don't have to say that our folks have to run for office. Like that might be upholding too much of the state. But I've never won a campaign where I didn't have an ally who was
Look.
for some form of government where we talked about the line. And also, if we are trying to transform a society, we're trying to transform a society, which means we're going to talk
Mhm.
to people who have our experiences and who are like, I've met a lot of people who also did police reform work, who did anti-police brutality work that wasn't abolitionist, that then came, like there is a political education process. And
Yeah.
therefore, I think in that tenor, we have to build power. And some of our folks are going to build governing power. Some of our folks are going to build electoral power. My goal is like, how do we keep the connective tissue between all of us who are building
Mhm.
towards kind of a just transition to actually get
Mhm.
there? As
Yeah.
opposed to, again, we don't need to be fighting over fascism versus authoritarianism, and we don't need, because no one has dismantled the state yet. I actually think there are things that we can work on together that both end fascism and build more liberatory futures for all of us.
Yeah.
And we'll figure it out because, yeah, I have, and it might be that what like to do the things I'm talking about, it does mean ending racialized racism. It does mean ending like police and prisons. And maybe it does mean ending concepts of states, but I'm pretty sure that the liberated state could be still on the journey. And
Mhm.
that that's where I see myself. And there's a debate in abolitionist organizing around like the state or not. And there are some people who are like, there's no way to abolish police and prisons if you believe in state or governments. I'm not one of them, right? But it doesn't mean I can't collaborate, work with, or really recognize all the other pieces we have in common. And I'm also like, you know what? Prove me wrong. Prove me wrong when we get there. But right
We've
now,
never done it before. This is all
these
new.
factions are coming.
Yep.
Our folks are on the line, and the number thing we need to build is power, right? I've been saying
Mhm.
a lot to folks that right now our offensive defense, that like the amount of power that we build, growing the size of our bases, figuring out the community protections strategies, but also figuring out, right, like how are people taking back, you know, the House, the Senate? How are people taking back both like how like forms of governance in their own states? And how are we also building the alternatives? Like these things, I don't think there's enough of us to spend our time in debate, because I actually think there's really there's plenty of work that we can build where we align. And that's if there's a practice we need right now, it is the practice of like finding the thing we agree on and building it, and continuing and staying in principled struggle around what we don't. But that, like, I think it's a sign of political immaturity that we cannot afford to disengage from each other, because who else is coming to save us but us?
Yeah, there's nobody else.
There's nobody else. That ain't gonna do it. Right? So right, like we're seeing that the way they're talking about how like woke is the problem, basically all the communities that we're from as the problem. So we already see that when shit gets hard, like who are they willing to throw out? So if we are not in a plan to say, you know what, yeah, we have a disagreement around this, but we have an agreement about Cop City, we have agreement about like this jail that needs to go. We have an agreement about the fact that we need larger base and larger power. Like we can do these things simultaneously. Everything does not have to be perfectly aligned from the outset to build power and to build the survival projects that we need, and to like build the kind of people power that we need to win.
Totally.
That's
well, I mean, look, that is a take. Well, the other thing, there's a couple of things that brings up for me. And one of them is that I do think that like trust and accountability do get built through doing stuff together, right? Like there's only so far that talking about ideas will build the trust that you need to like make that next leap, right? That like they're actually like, in order to have skin in the game with one another, we have to be engaged in organizing projects. We have to be engaged in mutual aid or, you know, blocking the next Cop City because they're building one here in Northern California. They're building, you know, they're they're doing it everywhere. Working for a free Palestine, whatever it might be, that like those are the things, those are the activities in which mutual accountability and trust actually get built, beyond yelling at each other on the internet, which I obviously, as a podcaster, this is my business.
No, it's part of it. Yeah. So it comes with the situation. And we also, like the impact of the pandemic and continued impacts of the pandemic on our ability to collaborate with each other and our ability to kind of like work on projects together, that is shifted, but it's also shown us all the ways that kind of disabled communities have been organizing for quite a while. But what we the safety you need to debate and not do is not the safety we have anymore.
Correct.
And that is like, and that realization will come into different people's movements, organizations, like bodies, you know, at different points in time. But I really, and it's different than saying these conversations. It's not saying these conversations aren't important. It's about,
they are deeply important. Yeah.
Like, can we have this conversation while we do the work together? Because I know when I was doing transformative justice work that included base building, which like was rare at the time because it was like, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago. People didn't, the door, someone doesn't, very rarely do you knock on someone's door and they say, I'm an abolitionist too, I would like to join. You know, what they say is, what they say is like, yeah, I think violence is a problem. Yeah, I think police are a problem too. I don't know if what you're saying makes sense to me, but I like that you all are doing something to help, and let's continue the conversation. So it's really about like establishing like what's needed to enter, what's needed to be kind of in the process together, and how do we continue to have these conversations. I would rather have this conversation around governance as we're building something more liberatory for each other. Let's have the debate then, right?
Yeah.
Let's have the debate then, because really what we're talking about at that point is the scale at which we think we can hold liberation. And that's a really interesting conversation in time and place.
Yeah, that is a very interesting question when you actually get into the meat of what that process looks like.
Exactly.
It also makes me think about some conversations we've been having on this show that I think also point to the fact that, like, getting free is also, and transforming our society is also a process of transforming ourselves. And that,
Yeah.
like, being willing to be transformed requires us
Yeah.
to be not just like trying to convince each other of things, but rather to
Yes.
like be in motion together and like be in practice together, which I think is like such a different orientation to the relationship than it is than trying to persuade, right? Persuasion is like a piece of the pie, but it's actually maybe a smaller piece than we've been led to believe by the sort of like the way that like like big P politics is traditionally done in this country,
Yeah.
or the way that commentators and pundits have convinced us that politics needs to be done. Yeah, and then I think what I'm hearing in really in what you're saying is like a lot of that work, and actually a lot of the work of transformative justice and of abolition, is about being open to both transforming others and transforming oneself through the process of
Yes.
winning real concrete goals.
Like we are building things we know we are still figuring out the for, right? We know that we know how much harm and violence is about people's needs for resources. It's about education, it's about the relationships that people are in. It's also about capitalism. It's also about racism. It's also about like homophobia, transphobia. It's about all the and so there is this piece where the way I was taught organizing and more specifically outreach is that there is a big piece, like, you know, because a lot of us come into the work because we're impressed about how good of a talker we are, right? Like how we win the words and make people listen and all this stuff. And really early on, it was like, this is about listening skills, right? This is about your listening skills. And that I believe both like every good organizing project, very good political education project is touched, shifted, and changed by the people we're engaging with. Because because that's also how people power and build power and exercise power, by having the agency to make those changes in a way that, like, why are people upset about the electoral process? Well, one of the reasons why is because they feel like they don't matter within it.
Yeah.
That nothing changes no matter what they do. Right? That, like, I'm against what's happening in Gaza. I'm against ceasefire. Nothing changes no matter what we do, but you're supposed to represent me, right? You're supposed to represent these values and these politics. So let our organizations, let our workshops, let all of our projects be sites where we can hear, listen, build, shift, and change, right?
That's beautiful. That is so rich, and it feels like this is the thing. Like this is it.
It's the goal. And the hardest thing about this next moment is that danger and fear are going to make it harder for us to listen to each other. Are going to make, like, going to be the line between self-preservation or self-defense and selfish are going to become murky, right? All of that is worked out amongst people and relationship, right?
Yeah.
But
yeah.
it is
like,
going to be like,
yeah, and like on top of all of our like trauma and grief and like weird vibes from like 8 years ago being completely reactivated in different ways.
Reactivated like... and what it like we just did an episode around safety, right? And it felt really important that in the conversation about safety, we delineated safety from abandonment, right? Right? And about, because for some people right now, our first step is, how do I get out of here? Right? Yeah. And we wanted to shift the conversation to like, how do we all make it? You know? And if you have the resources to get out of here, this like where that step is where flee is the move. But right now it's like, how do we kind of wrap each other in protection and keep moving towards the goal?
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
This is great.
Yeah, it's been so nice to talk to you. Is there anything else that you want our listeners to know? Is there any other stuff that you'd like to leave folks with this week?
I mean, I think that to the extent that we can, I want folks to fortify themselves for what's coming. I think there are some urgent things to do right now, depending on your own personality, around like folks are gathering their healthcare needs, like they're gathering stuff for trans healthcare. They're all gathering stuff for like reproductive healthcare. Like there are certain things that are critical right now, but there's another piece that's really just about like, take a breath so we can be clear together and we can make the moves we need. So I think that's what I want. Like, we're going to need, we've always needed each other to survive. So many of us know that we are the people that get ignored, discarded, left behind, and so I think what's really, really, what I want people to know is like, there's also a piece around how we get our bodies and our spirits and our brains ready to kind of build the collaborations we need under scarier times, because it's possible. We've done it. And while everyone did not survive, someone did survive for us to be here. And, and we want to make sure that, that as many of our folks make it through what's coming, so that we can get to those liberated futures. That's all I got for you.
That's all. NBD.
That's all. Just a little bit.
Ejeris, where can listeners find you, find more of your work, hear more from you?
Yes. So people can go to the fascismbarometer.org to learn all of the pod. They can also check me out at Ejerie Labs, and I also have my own website. So there's like a bunch of projects. You'll be hearing more from me, and really it's just like, but honestly, like, doing the work is also how we connect with each other. So I'm excited to see people in all the work.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Take care. I'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
My thanks again to Jo-Hyun Park and Ejeris Dixon for joining me today. Jo-Hyun's piece, "Was South Korea's Coup an Attempt to Restart the Korean War?" is available to read at peoplesdispatch.org, and we will put a link to that in the show notes. You can also check out Ejeris's The Fascism Barometer, wherever you get podcasts, and find more resources at their website. Again, we'll put lots of links in the show notes. This show is published by Convergence, a magazine for radical insights. I'm Caden Mock, and our producer is Josh Elstro. If you've got something to say, please drop me a line. You can send me an email that we'll consider running on an upcoming mailbag episode at mailbag@convergencemag.com. And if you'd like to support the work that we do at Convergence, bringing our movements together to strategize, struggle, and win in this crucial historical moment, you can become a member at convergencemag.com/donate. Even a few bucks a month goes a long way to making sure our independent small team can continue to build a map for our movements. I hope this helps.